with 2 rounds of funding, one to build up the idea and one now to start building the tool, we now have a system that as of April is delivering to a selected set of people daily newsletters, and that in the next few weeks we're going to be opening broad recruitment for, and we expect the first external experiments to be launching in early 2025. I'll warn you right up front, if you're thinking about, I want to be one of those people, you'll hear about our intake process. Don't wait. It's probably for most people about a 2-month process to go from, I want to do this, to I have the approvals, I built the stuff, I've tested it. And so now is a wonderful time to get started. Just so you've got an idea of what the POPROX newsletter looks like, although it changed its look in the last couple of days, and it will probably change again, it's a newsletter with news, articles, but not the actual contents. The reason we don't have the contents is partly licensing, and partly we want people to click to read it so that we actually get feedback. If everything of value were in the newsletter, there's not much we can actually get back in the way of feedback. Last way of summarizing this, what we're aiming to provide is an agile and responsive platform. What I mean by agile and responsive is we're launching with minimal functionality. We're launching with enough to keep users happy and maybe to run a couple of test experiments. But the functionality that we have in January will depend on researchers who come to us in November and say, here's what I need for my experiment. And then we'll put people on, hey, we've got to expand the platform to have that feature. Sometimes we're going to tell you, great idea, we can't do it. But most of the time we're hoping we're going to be able to say, yeah, that's something that we can do. We offer support for algorithm and interface studies. You can change which news articles are delivered. You can change the order they're in. You can change the short summaries and the text headers. You can add things like explanations. You can change layouts. All of those things are there. We'll have a substantial set of user studies and some behavioral data. It is possible to add custom things for the survey data. We'll provide you with real users who are not there because it's your experiment. And as we build up the data, we'll provide you with access to data in advance so you can validate whether this seems worth running an experiment on. Hello. Oh, I did go. Is this the right slide? I think so. Okay, you'll hear more about this later, but there are a few limitations you should be aware of. From a technical perspective, while POPROX is a newsletter sent by email, there's a lot of feedback we can't get because the mailers block it. I would love to tell you where they scrolled to, where they paused. The mailers won't give us that data. One day we would love to expand to an app where we can get all sorts of additional data. We don't have it. Our current content is all fairly neutral, high quality journalism. It's coming from the Associated Press, an enormous network of reporters providing coverage of a wide range of things. It is US centric, but it's worldwide coverage. And we will add other providers over time who are willing to do this. But right now, if what you wanted to study was extremist content, you're not going to find any. There are certain restrictions on researchers. The main ones are you don't have any access to the participants. We mediate all the communication. That has a lot of specific things involved. You can't attempt to reverse engineer it. You can't get free text input, other things like that. We also do not support harmful deception, pornography, and advertising in studies. The news content is available for you to use, but only within the confines of an experiment in the system. Because of licensing restrictions, you can't say, oh, cool, you've got all this news. I'm going to go train a new LLM and then export it out and use it in other places. And similarly, you can't serve the news content and say, I want to be a daily newspaper in my community. I'll just deliver the news to people. That's basically it. The last thing is our own community-driven set of requirements, which is this is all about open research. Our code is open source. Everything that we do is going to be provided openly, but that's also an expectation we put on our experimenters, that at the time of an experiment, the design is published on our site. And after publication or after you've abandoned publication, the data gets published so that other people can learn from it and potentially replicate it. We hope you'll also publish code. That's not something we require at this point. Okay, example studies. Just as you're thinking about this, I want you to think about 3 studies. And that's going to carry us through. It's really 3 kinds of studies. One of them is, gee, I just have a new recommender, or I have an existing recommender I want to test in this context. If you think about that study, what you're saying is, hey, give me the request for what things should be in the newsletter for this person, give me their profile, give me all of the options that are available, and I'm going to return to you a list of news articles in order. That's the simplest kind of study in certain ways. There's going to be a set of you that are thinking of interface-only studies. And by interface-only, I mean the presentation, right? I want to put explanatory tags on every article to explain what they're about so that you're more likely to read them if you're interested in them. Great, we can do that. I think linear presentation is problematic and I want to lay them out differently. We could do that. And then the third thing, which I think some of the interesting ones are going to fall into, is I actually want to play with everything. I'm just going to replace POPROX standard default for the entire generation of the newsletter. I'm going to come up with my own subset of content. I'm going to come up with my own layout. And I will either run my own control or run it against your default system to have a control to study. And we can support all 3 of those. Okay, let me turn it over to Sophia for architecture. Sure.
Okay. All right, so I'll briefly go through some architecture stuff. We'll actually dig into more details later on. Here's our architecture highlights. Like the fonts might not be that large, but basically we are a cloud-based platform. So both the platform code and your experiment code will live on AWS. So there are a lot of S3 buckets you can actually call and query and share the data between. You need to prepare your own computing resources, meaning that if you want to run some kind of large language models, you want to run some other kind of models that will be computing expensive, we will not help you host that. You need to host your own code, and all our code are actually public, so you can fork our repos, and then you host it, apply your customization and anything, and then query our databases. And this kind of process is actually encrypted, so all the users' information will actually not be leaked. They will only be anonymized. And then the platform and the interfaces communication is via HTTP API. So you will send as a JSON file the user profile data, and then the candidate articles. Those will all be from our POPROX databases. We'll prepare those data stream for you. And then you will expect a list of articles with display information, including the headlines, blurbs, images, that all the components that can actually build up daily email. Then recommender controls the item displays, and we will share like the code link later. Everything is open sourced, so you can actually see how the logic actually works. And there are some measurements. Okay, I'm not going to dig into details, but basically we have a suite of both behavior measurements such as article clicks, the CTRs, hit rate, impression like metrics such as RBPs and MMR. And then we also have some perception measurements such as like regular user surveys. I believe we send that every 5 weeks now. There's like a validated instruments to measure their satisfaction, perceived novelty, things like that cannot be captured only by their clicks. There's also content measurements. So we have a suite of metrics applied to delivered news contents like diversity or like NLP-based things like that. And for offline measurements, you can, again, design your own stuff, or we also actually already include some standard ones, including NDCGs like RMSEs, and then you can actually validate your new algorithms with the mine datasets, which we actually train our base model upon. And then we actually have the evaluation code in the code base already. So you can actually pull that and take a run on your own. And I think this is for, yeah.
All right, so so I'm here to talk a little bit about working with POPROX, working with us. I guess I need to stand here so I see what's on the screen. And one thing I really want to emphasize is that we want you to be successful. We want you to run good experiments, for them to turn out great, for you to get interesting results, for you to publish at RecSys or some other lesser conference, but maybe at RecSys. And so, you know, one of the things that's part of our mandate as this team, people who are in this room and other people who couldn't be here, is to help you do your science. That's what we're here for. So, and so we have these stages by which you interact with the POPROX team, with the POPROX system. And so we're going to kind of walk through those stages right now. And this is kind of gives you a preview of what to expect if you decide, oh, okay, I want to work with POPROX. I want to run my experiment on this newsletter with real users. What is that going to look like? So the first stage is what we call intake. And that's the point at which we start the conversation with you. You tell us, oh, I really have this great idea for generating headlines, you know, with a large language model, or whatever your idea is. And then we start to work with you to sort of specify that idea at a level of detail where we can really understand what it is you're trying to do. Is it a good fit for POPROX? Is it something we can actually do? If you want to measure, you know, people's news reaction via eye tracking, probably POPROX is not, you know, going to be useful to you. But this will help both of us kind of understand what's there. And actually, I was going to, I think I'm going to skip the intake form just because in interest of time, but you can get it from the QR code there. The intake form basically has some information about you, about your research questions that you're trying to explore, how you think it might fit into POPROX, you know, how many users you think you need. Some of these things you might not know the answer to. You're like, wow, I never thought about that. And that's fine, because again, as I was saying, we're here to work with you, and we expect that there will be cycles of consultation. You'll be like, oh, I'm not sure what to put here. What did other people do? We will help you work through that, and eventually you'll have a completed intake form that we can work with. So once you're past the intake stage, that means that you and us both agree that this is an experiment that will work on POPROX and that satisfies your, you know, research goals as an experimenter. And now we work with you to help you turn that into an experiment that the system can actually run. So one piece of that, which we don't do, is write the code. Okay, you do that. So if you want to, you know, explore a new recommendation algorithm, you code that up, you make it so it's compatible with our API. All of that's on you. But there are other pieces that happen at this stage. Specifying different treatments. Am I, you know, do I want to, you know, give different kinds of users different kinds of experiences? Do I have a staged design to my experiment where I show you one kind of newsletter and then I show you another one and see how you react to these differences? There are a lot of different experimental designs that we can support. And so, you know, we need to sort of hammer out all the details of exactly what that's going to look like. And the second piece, which is very important here, is going to be the human subjects aspect. So as Joe was saying before, we have experiment participants. They have already consented to be part of our experiments, but your institution probably has specific requirements about running those kinds of experiments, and they've never heard of POPROX. So you're going to have to get your local, whatever that mechanism is in your local institution, you're going to have to make sure you've met those requirements, and they understand what it is you're doing and that it's approved. So at this point, you will have, once you're done with this phase, you will have those protocols approved, and you will have something that we call a manifest. And, oh, I thought I had a picture of the manifest, no? I guess it's later. Okay. Let me go back. We'll see an example of a manifest in a second. But the manifest basically is the technical description of your experiment that our tools can compile. And if you could read the very tiny print in this slide back here, you would see, here's the manifest down here in the lower left-hand corner. That is a key input to sort of like here, let the system know, okay, what experiment am I running? Eventually, we imagine that we'll be able to run multiple experiments at once. Right now, we're only going to be able to run one at a time, but then we would have sort of multiple manifests in operation at the same time. Okay, so you've specified your experiment, you've done all the approvals, so your institution is okay with it. Now we need to test, right? We don't want to run into problems once the newsletter is actually being delivered. We want to encounter any of those kinds of problems in advance. We are still kind of finalizing what that test regimen will look like. We know there will be a couple different kinds of tests. We'll want to make sure the output from your system looks the way you expect it to look, the way we expect it to look. We'll want to make sure that it runs fast enough that when you actually have a bunch of users you're delivering recommendations to, that you'll be able to send out the newsletter in a timely manner. And then we will also run a stage of what we call dark live testing, where your code will produce recommendations for your users under the experimental conditions that we expect, but none of those newsletters will actually be delivered to the users. That will be kind of under the radar thing, and then we will look at those, you will look at those and verify, yes, these are the recommendations I expect it to be producing. This is what the screen should look like. Here's my, my explanations or my tags or whatever they are look the way I expect. Everybody signs off. We wheel the spacecraft out to the launch pad, and then we're ready for this operational stage. Okay, so your experiment goes live. That means that corresponding to the manifest, the users who are specified there and the treatments that are specified there, your API gets called, you deliver recommendations, explanations, whatever it is part of your experiment. Those things get incorporated into our newsletters. Those get emailed out to users, and then they click on your mail, react to your interfaces, whatever it is that users are going to be doing. They fill out surveys, our surveys, your surveys, and the duration of operational phase will depend on the experiment you're running. It'll depend on kind of what's your intervention, what do you think the effect size is, and so forth. That's something that we work out in these earlier phases. So it may be different for different experiments, how long the operational phase is. And then these experiments are monitored by us, by you. Something terrible happens, we can just switch people back to the original experience. Hopefully everything goes great. But we're monitoring the metrics, and we'll send that information to you. It's like, here's how your experiment is doing. And then your experiment concludes. You've run through all the phases of it. The users get reassigned potentially to other experiments, and so that part is done. And then there's a final piece that we will contribute here, and that is to compile a set of metrics. We talked about the metrics a little bit earlier. Report those out to you, both the behavioral data, the survey data. So there's a standard package there. And then there will also be the ability to get raw data in terms of logs and other information about how your experiment actually happened. One of our requirements from the sort of design phase was actually the user IDs are hashed in a way that is experiment specific. And so that means that if somebody, nobody here, of course, but if somebody violates the terms of their agreement with us and shares the data in a way that is not approved, like posting it on a public website or something like that, we'll actually be able to trace it back to you. So that's just a little bit of enforcement for our non-disclosure agreement that you have to enter into. After a particular embargo period, we talked about the open research model. That data will become available to other researchers, but it'll never be public. That's part of our agreement with AP and with the Institutional Research Board. Anybody who wants to use POPROX data, even if they're not running an experiment, still has to go through a process of agreeing to our terms, and then we'll release the data to them. And that might be a way that you want to use our data, even if you don't want to run a live experiment. You might want to see logs of how people have used POPROX. Okay, so those are the stages. And again, I want to emphasize this again. I said it at the beginning. We want you to be successful. We want to help you be successful. We want to, the reason these stages are there is to try and maximize the chance that your experiment is successful. We expect many of the people who do this have never worked in live, with live user studies before. I have never run live A/B testing on sort of experimental subjects like this. So we know that we have to sort of walk through these stages and help you do it. And then as we develop more experience with the system, as Joe was saying, we haven't actually run real experiments yet because we don't have experimental subjects on which we can do that yet. We will start to develop a library of best practices. We'll know what works well, and we can help you take advantage of that sort of community knowledge. All right, so a little bit more about this design. It's like, okay, I have an idea. How do I go about it? So just some things to know. I think we've talked about some of these things already. There's a newsletter every day. Your code's going to run every day. You're going to be expected to produce a newsletter. You can do kind of as much as or as little as you want in terms of customizing its display or other aspects. You pick what you want to explore. It will be choosing from that day's news. And so that kind of is the scope of what we can play around with. We do have these limitations around the mail client. So some mail clients let you put in tracking pixels. Others, will have you, let you respond to a variety of, widgets in the HTML. But there's extreme variety in terms of what is supported. And actually, Gmail, which is pretty common, is very, very locked down in terms of what you can do. So we're kind of going with the least common denominator of interactivity so that we get the most number of usable subjects, but that means that there isn't a lot of interactivity. Mostly it is click on this article and go read it. As Joe was saying, the clicks go to AP so that when you read the full article, when somebody reads the full article, they are reading it on the AP site. That is part of our contract with them. We don't grab the data and display it ourselves. We don't know the user population size yet. We're aiming for a first wave of 100 or 300 users or so, eventually building up into the low thousands. We are not planning to compete with Yahoo News or with millions of users. We wouldn't be able to support that with our computing infrastructure anyway. And there are some questions still unknown, again, because the system doesn't have a real user base yet. How often do people click on stories? We don't know. We're distributing newsletters in our team, but we click on stuff because we're trying to provide the system with data, not because we're sort of organically reading news, not necessarily a good indicator. So there are some things we don't know. As we know those things, that will make it easier to design experiments in the future. Now, if you're really interested in collaborative signals, this might not be a great platform for you just because it's all cold start. Every day, new stories. Like the definition of what you're not interested in is old news, right? Don't tell me that, it's old news, right? So for the most part, you're going to be looking at fresh stuff every day, not a lot of collaborative signal unless you do some additional work. And so probably you'll be focusing a lot on content, especially at the beginning. We have this implicit feedback. For the most part, these sort of click-throughs. You'll potentially be able to use the results of surveys, but those aren't as frequent as the newsletters themselves. The other thing is, users are not compensated. If we paid people to use POPROX, number one, we'd run out of money in a hurry, and we don't want to run out of money. But also, we want it to be kind of authentic. Yeah, we were trying to get, I think that's better. Yeah, thank you. We're trying to get, authentic news reading interactions, which would be different if you said, oh, well, you don't get paid unless you click on 5 things a week or something. It's just, it probably wouldn't, you wouldn't get people's authentic interaction. Now, it could be, if you want people to fill out, a 20-minute survey every week, okay, you might have to compensate them. Your IRB might say you have to compensate them. And that's okay. We can work with that if you need to do that, but it's not the default. So we're not asking people to, we're not supporting sort of laboratory experiments where you say, okay, users in my experiment are going to go do this thing. They're going to just read the news like they always have, and then you'll see what happens. Oh yeah, here's the example manifest. So this is kind of that output of, and you can't read it. But some of these things come from us, so you'll have an experiment ID, team ID, all this kind of stuff. But then you will be supplying some of these things in bold here, like here's my AWS endpoint. This is the thing you call when you want to get recommendations back. Maybe I specify multiple endpoints for different different aspects of the experiment, different treatments that users get. You'll see here things like what's the sequence of stages or phases of a experiment that people go through. Maybe they see one newsletter this week and a different one 2 weeks from now, and duration of those experiments and so forth. So it's long. This is just a sort of snippet of it, but you kind of get a sense for, here's kind of what that outcome of the design looks like. Now, as Joe was saying, we think of this in a very dynamic and kind of sort of just-in-time way. We are not going to sit down and build every capability that every experimenter might need and then wait for people to come to us. We don't have that much time. We don't have that much money. You guys don't want to wait. What we want to do is create the system with the capabilities that it needs, and then have people come to us and say, oh, this would be really great if. And maybe that's something we already do. Maybe it's not. If it's not, we'll put that on our queue of software priorities, and then build that feature so that you can run the experiment that you want. So we very much, we think of ourselves as community infrastructure, and so the community is going to tell us what makes POPROX useful. We can guess, because we are researchers ourselves, but you will probably come up with things that we had not thought about, and that's great. We want you to do that. It's also the case that we do not have an indefinite amount of software engineering resources, so we will roll out features as we implement them and as they're needed for experiments that are going through this pipeline, and we say, okay, that thing has passed the intake phase. It's like, we want to run that experiment, but wait, it needs this. We don't have that yet. Those are the things that we will prioritize. I think Joe talked about this a little bit. All the user data is anonymized by the platform, so you will not have access to things like people's email addresses or anything like that. We're sending the email. You don't need the email address, and in fact, your life is better if you don't have that personally identifiable data. There is an umbrella protocol that covers the platform as a whole. That we just got approved pretty recently after many months of back and forth. And the idea behind the umbrella protocol is if you're doing things kind of within this range, you don't need to do anything with us to additionally qualify it. You will still need to get your local institution to approve it. And then some things may require additional approval if they're sort of outside of the box. We'll say a little bit about that. As Joe mentioned, inappropriate content, significant deception, things that might be harmful to the user base. We don't want to scare people away from POPROX and lose users that we've spent a long time recruiting. So some things will be just disallowed. Other things will be outside of our initial protocol, and we'll have to have them reviewed by our advisory board, by our IRB, as well as, of course, your own IRB. Things like, you may say, well, I want to see if I slant the headlines in a particular way, can I piss people off? Okay, like, well, if you had a good reason to do that experiment, we might actually let you do that, but we would, that would go outside the bounds of what's already approved. So then we would have to go back to our IRB and say, oh, we think this is an important experiment, but it's not something that is within the sort of pre-approved box. We'll work with you to make that possible. And there's just some other examples here of things that aren't in our in the sort of existing protocol right now, but that we could talk about. So some of the key points on this, and then I think I'll wrap up my part. You do not have to get consent. That's already taken care of by virtue of people agreeing to work with POPROX. You won't have any of that personally identifiable information. That's actually easier for you. We handle all of that. And then you don't have to manage experimental data. You get that package that's delivered at the end of your experiment with the logs and the metrics and so forth. So you don't have to necessarily keep track of everything that's happening as you're generating recommendations. We're keeping track of that. Okay, and then I'm going to hand it over to Michael.
Hello. So if that all sounds exciting, let's talk about how to actually do it. So what we provide from a technical perspective is the platform itself, everything you've just been hearing about for engaging with the users, delivering the emails, measuring the responses, etc. We also provide software libraries for building and implementing a recommendation and display logic and wiring it into our responses. And it's built in a modular way so that you can just replace the individual components that are relevant to your experiment. And then we provide access to training and offline evaluation data as you're developing and preparing and hyperparameter tuning, etc. Your models as needed. Some experiments probably won't actually need that, but those are the core technical pieces that we provide. So a different view of our architecture, that we've got our users. We will provide the users, but the users are there providing their attention. And then we provide a lot of different pieces in the middle. We're providing all of this data storage, data management, the orchestration infrastructure to actually send the emails at 6 a.m. every day or whatever time they're scheduled for, administering the surveys and collecting those responses and tying them back to the actual click histories and emails that went out, etc. And all you have to provide are the recommendation pieces, whether those are algorithmic pieces, whether those are display pieces, or in the future as we support more interaction, those are interactive pieces. And then if you are doing evaluation that involves your own custom survey questions or items or instruments, those for integration into our survey delivery, and then any additional data analysis that you want to do on the final package. Core things we'll be providing there. So you don't have to provide very much in the grand scheme of things of all of the pieces needed in order to deliver and run and monitor and measure this experiment. The core interface between us and you is an HTTP API. So you give us your endpoint URL in that manifest, And then our email scheduler kicks off each day, and for each user, it's going to send a request to the URL that the endpoint that you give us, and we're going to send you user profile information. So a user identifier that is just an opaque UUID. You will not be able to use that to identify them anywhere else. Also, if you run multiple experiments in the platform and you happen to get the same user, they're going to have a different UUID when you see them the next time. Each experiment is a distinct set of users from an identifier perspective. Also, some basic information that we've collected in onboarding. So currently, we have a very lightweight survey about a user's interest in different news topics. That's stored, and that's going to be available for your recommendation. We also send their interaction history, the articles that they have clicked on in the past. And then we send you the candidate articles, yesterday's news articles. Or if the system evolves, so there's other candidate sets, it might be a different candidate set. For today, it's everything published yesterday by the AP. We provide you this candidate set, and then any other parameters you've configured in your manifest that we're supposed to send to your endpoint. So if you just have one server that's serving 3 different experimental variants, and you give us this parameter to tell your thing which variant, that we'll send that to. So that's what we send you. And then your service responds to that with the recommendation list. And that is going to be, right now we only support a single ranked list. We're working on expanding that to things like sections, but for now it's a single ranked list of the articles with their title, their URL, their little snippet thing. So if you want to change how the headlines are displayed, if you want to change the headlines, you just put different headlines in that response that you sent. And so that's the exchange between our system and yours. You get the candidates as a part of the request. The logic that we provide implements some caching on top of that, so you don't keep having to recompute over the same candidate all of the time if you don't want to. But that's the interface between us and you. And we've got the exact interfaces here. They're defined in our online documentation. So to actually implement this, to build something that hooks into these, so we provide a template repository. And it is technically possible to implement the endpoint yourself, but for now, we very, very, very strongly recommend that you start with our template repository. We might extend those options in the future, but basically, you start with our template repository, fork it on GitHub, check it out, and then start implementing your changes as new components for this, in the context of our repository. And then once you've got it implemented, you've done your offline tests, pre-flight validation, etc., you then deploy it to AWS Lambda. We've got it set up to deploy to Lambda. Eventually, there might be other options, but for now, we're focusing on that deployment path. It's easy. You don't have to pay for a machine that's running 24/7. You're only paying for the compute needed to respond to the daily batch of newsletters, and then Amazon nicely shuts it down for you. And then you stick the URL for this Lambda into your experiment manifest. You can have multiple variants of multiple variants. If you've got, say, 3 different experimental conditions, you can have those all served up by one thing and the variant isn't a parameter, or if it makes more sense for your thing, you can set up 3 different Lambda functions, maybe if they each have different model checkpoints involved, and have those separate. Either one is fine. We just see HTTP URLs. So we've got a repository, and we've got links to this stuff on our documentation site. That's the POPROX recommender. It's being developed in the public right now, so you can watch our pull requests and things go through. Where, with the interest of open science and reproducible science, we are, for this repository and for our experiments and just in general across our pipelines, we're using a tool called data version control to manage data artifacts, exports from the database, model checkpoints from Hugging Face or from our own training processes or wherever they come from. to manage all of that. And data version control does versioning and tracking and integrity checking of large data files. And it also handles data workflow pipeline steps. So like run the recommender to generate recommendations for these test users, run the evaluator to generate metrics, run the Jupyter notebook to produce a chart. Like those steps all become automated and tied to the content version so that, okay, we have a new data dump for evaluation, rerun the whole thing end to end, produce results, and it's all automated, it's all reproducible, and then we provide the points in here so that you then can add your own modifications to this to evaluate in the same way. And so when you clone our Git repository, we've created a DVC repository that's publicly accessible, or will be once I click the right permission button, so that you can get enough to start reproducing our offline evaluation results with the mined data. So publicly, you'll have that to play with the code. Once you've executed, once we have enough users that we have user data, and you have signed the data access agreement, then you will get access to a repository that will have actual POPROX user data in it that you can pull in and run those pieces of the evaluation training process. The recommendation code is built around a pipeline architecture. Probably the other thing that's most similar to is Haystack. But we wire these pipelines together from a number of small components that could together combine to produce the full recommendation experience, or this full set of recommendations. So we have our inputs that I talked about, the user history, the user profile, the candidate articles. They then actually feed into two parallel pipelines. We have the personalized pipeline where we're embedding the articles, both the user articles and the user's clicked articles and the candidate articles for the day. We're using the same embedder, but two different inputs. We then combine the user's clicked articles and their profile into a user embedding. And then we feed those, the candidate embeddings, the user embeddings into a scorer. And then from that, we produce rankings or final results. And we're using a softmax. Our current default experience is using a softmax sampler to generate stochastic rankings from these scores. We're also generating top K rankings so we can compare the differences that are introduced by the scorer or by a different re-ranker. We then have a fallback, so if the user doesn't have any clicked articles for us to embed, we just do recommendation that's sampling articles from the topics that they said they're interested in, and then we fill them in. So if we don't have enough articles from the personalized pipeline to make a newsletter, we fill in any missing articles, which might be all of them, from this topic-based fallback, and then we send the newsletter. But this is all implemented in that repository. So you change any one or more of these pieces or how they're wired together that you need to implement your thing. So if you like our scoring, which is done with NMRS, but you want to change, okay, how do we compute those scores into ranks and produce the final, compose the final newsletter? You just need to change this piece, reuse our scores, reuse our trained model, checkpoints, and just implement that piece. If all you want to do is that I want to just use your recommendations, and I'm going to experiment with changing the lead. Maybe I will machine translate it into the user's language for multilingual users, something like that. You just add a new component in front of this that takes the ranked articles and just changes the headline before they go to the final newsletter. So you just put in the individual pieces that you need for your experiment and reuse as much of the rest as makes sense. It does mean that you need to write your components to fit our infrastructure, but it also means you don't need to write near as much. We are agnostic to the underlying technology. So our compute-intensive things, the embedders, the scorer, we have implemented those with PyTorch. But you can use PyTorch, you can use TensorFlow, you can use JAX. Whatever your favorite thing is, raw scikit-learn. We're agnostic to that in the pipeline. So yeah, as I just said, implement just the pieces that you need. We also use transformers and NumPy in some stages of the pipeline. So our article embedder is Distilbert run into an NMRS embedder all implemented with transformers and PyTorch. So you can implement just the pieces that you need. Then you've implemented all of these pieces. Before we go to users, we probably want to do at least some kind of an offline evaluation, maybe some hyperparameter tuning. We have the code in there to do offline evaluation with the mined data. Once we have actual POPROX user data for evaluation, we will be adding the code to do evaluation with real POPROX user data. Our key metric, so our key both offline eval metric and behavioral online metric that we're looking at is RBP, rank biased precision. It's very similar to NDCG. But with a different and a reconfigurable attention model. And so we're going to start with a generic attention model, but once we get enough data from POPROX users, we may look at calibrating that attention model to more closely match what our users are doing. But our rank bias precision is our key behavioral and offline eval metric for the time being. We're also tracking mean reciprocal rank and NDCG. We're also doing some measurements. So I said we're pulling the top K recommendations in addition to whatever we're doing. We're doing that so we can compute rank biased overlap so that we can measure, oh, you've got this diversifier. We have some diversifiers in there that aren't running live right now. You want to measure, okay, how much is my diversifier changing the recommendations from top K by score? The evaluation allows us to extract rankings at different stages of the pipeline so you can do those kinds of comparisons and see how much the ranking is changing or how much the performance is changing if you measured the different the outputs of the different stages. We're working on adding diversity metrics over various dimensions of diversity, content, topic, etc. So as I said, you deploy to Lambda plus an API gateway. The model here is bring your own compute. So we do not provide the AWS compute budget for running your experiment. You provide, so you set up your own AWS tenant billing to your university or institution. You deploy in there. You give us the endpoint URL. We do prefer that you deploy in US East 1 because that's where we're deploying, and then we don't have the interzone data transit charges for either of us. And then, so this is in progress. We're going to be adding the ability to do evaluation and fine tuning with actual POPROX user data. We've discussed some things like offering the ability to pre-embed those candidate articles rather than having to cache them on demand. Caching works pretty well, but there may be interesting to pre-embed. We're also interested in hearing from you. What do you need to run your experiment? There are some things in this design that are probably different than what you're used to. And part of that, as Joe said at the beginning, part of our goal with this project is to change the field in terms of how we think about evaluation, but also in terms of how we think about constructing recommender pipelines and recommender data flows. And so talk with us about what you need, but there are some things that are going to be a little bit different because we're trying to, like, both the needs of the platform, working with real users, and also with trying to move towards designs that enable us to do the kinds of evaluations and experiments that are good for the field in the long run. So that's how that's building the actual experiment itself. So you do all of that. You do the pre-flight testing that Robin talked about. You get it going out to your users. They get your recommendations for 6 weeks. They read some articles. They take some surveys. Now what? So we have multiple aspects to evaluation. So we have offline evaluation for pre-flight testing, for ongoing testing, for hyperparameter tuning, etc. But then the real meat of the evaluation is the online evaluation, both behavioral evaluation, users' clicks and interactions with the platform, with the content, and the perceptual evaluation from the user study or from the surveys, and then also content evaluation that are looking at things like the diversity, the composition of the actual email newsletters, the content, the content of the actual email newsletters, 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 the content of the actual email newsle or the recommendation list that you're sending out. And these together provide a lot of insight into what your system's doing and how it's affecting users, how they're responding to it. So at the end of the day, your experiment's done. This data package Robin talked about. What's in that? There's a few things. One is the actual data export. Then also the metrics and the code to compute the standard metrics. So all of the metrics that we're standardizing on, we're providing the implementations of those metrics. We also ask that you use those implementations in official computations. Just for clarity, like if you're reporting RBP on the POPROX data, use our RBP, so that way when there's 20 papers that have all been published, RBP on POPROX, we know they're all doing it the same way. If you want to do something different, call it something else, my RBP or whatever. But like, we're providing the code, but we do want to see standardization there so that as more people work with the data, work with the platform, we can actually compare across papers because we're reporting the standardized metrics in a standardized way. So, and then eventually something that's in progress is a validated report from us that's like, okay, so here's the official report of all of our standard metrics, what happened with your experiment. So the data package contents, we're going to give you a log of all of the newsletters. We encourage you to do your own logging on just for your own purposes, but we're going to give you, we record every newsletter that goes out. And so for your experiment, for each experimental condition, you'll have a log of every newsletter that we sent with all of its content, the articles that the user clicked on, and then the responses, the survey responses for users, both to our standard instruments, to your custom instruments, over the course of your experiment. So you're going to get that data, so you can track the actual impressions or newsletters to the clicks and those user survey responses. As I said, we're going to give you code for computing all of our standard metrics, and that's going to include both we have some of this written, some of this is in progress or soon future development, but for all of these metrics, the behavioral metrics, the content metrics, the perceptual metrics, we'll be providing standard code so that you can do the standard analysis on this in a standard way that's compliant with current best practices. But then you have the data, so if there are additional supplementary analyses that you want to do, you can do those with the raw data. And then, as I said, reports that have this, like, okay, so our code did the factor analysis and is reporting how your thing scored on the serendipity construct or whichever one is in there, or the perceived diversity construct. You get that in the final report. We don't have this yet, but we'll be working on developing it. And so by the time you're ready to run experiment, you're ready to have your experiment done, you can expect to see some of these reports being provided in your final result. So we provide all of that. You provide some of this. We provide to you, but we also have. But we're going to be public. As Joe said, this is all open. So post-experiment, or when you publish, when you give up, possibly after an embargo period, the data that was used for your experiment, like the data results, that data package that you got, your experiment manifest, so that researchers in the community can see exactly what experiment produced this data that they're working with, and also they can see, oh, that's what the manifest looked like for this experiment that's kind of similar to mine. I can work with that. And then the metrics and results and outcomes. So other researchers in the community can see here the experiments that have been run. Also, users can see if they're curious. If they say, I signed up for this scientific news recommendation service, I wonder if it's produced any results. They won't be able to tell, oh, I was in that experiment in that condition. But they can see, like, oh, I've been reading these newsletters, and these are some of the results, and then a link to the paper as well. So the users can also see the science that they've been contributing to, for those users who find that interesting and are motivated by it. So yes, as I said, everything's, and as Joe said earlier, everything's eventually public. Well, public-ish. Some things will be public, the metric results, but the data, all of the data, anything that has like actual user responses, user newsletters, etc., that will be what we're calling shared. It will be available to people who have signed the data access agreement to be able to get access to it. And then we will be having data protection, various data protection strategies. The first level is that data access agreement. You're not going to be able to just click and download a data set like you do on Movie Lens. You're actually going to need to sign the agreement that like prohibits you from going and trying to figure out who our users are and those kinds of things. It's going to be like, to just get the data, it's going to be a relatively lightweight agreement, but there will be a formal agreement in place. And access user IDs are not persistent, so you won't be able to correlate them between experiments or between experiments in any particular data dump. We're also applying principles from the US Census in order to do data limitation around demographic attributes to just make it harder for users to be re-identified demographically. And as both we as a team and the broader recommender systems community, data protection communities, learn more about how to protect user data, how to protect human subjects data, we expect to be evolving these data protections as more best practices are developed. But those are some of the things that we're looking at now so that we can share the data with you. You can use it for research, but our users and their data are protected both for general ethical, moral, privacy concerns, and also for legal compliance and regulatory concerns around human subjects research, etc. So that gets us to the end. You've heard a lot from us, but one of the things we really wanted to be able to do here, we wanted to share with you the platform, the things you can do with it, get you to start thinking about it. But we'd really like to hear from you. What experiment? So first, I mean, what questions do you have? But also, what experiment do you want to run on POPROX? And what kinds of features of support, either technical features or support from us, do you think that you might need in order to run that experiment? So thank you very much. And yes, if you have questions, we will be happy to take those now. Yes. Oh, okay.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much. That's a very, very interesting project, and I guess it's much needed. Must have been a ton of work for you. So thanks for that. I have too many questions. Maybe the most important for me right now is what are the expected costs of an experiment? Like for myself, like if I wanted to run my system on the configuration that you recommended, what do you think? How expensive that's going to be?
Well, one answer to that question is nothing. So you do not have to pay us to participate, right? And I think we did have some estimates of what our current code costs, but I don't remember what.
I think we're paying less than $1 a week for sending newsletters to our people. Like it's pennies per newsletter at most.
So there's three things that could lead to significant costs, and there's two ways you could address that, and a third one you can't fix anything about. If you have, either by rule or by your own ethics, the desire to compensate people, we're probably going to charge you sort of a 20% service fee to actually deliver gift certificates to people and all that. The second is if you're doing something with computationally expensive recommendation, the techniques that we're using right now are very cheap. We can deliver a newsletter for well under a penny. But if you come in and say, well, no, I'm going to run this against a large language model, that's going to be a substantial additional cost. I should also say at this point, we're only guaranteeing that we won't charge any fees through the end of 2025. We hope that we will have a continued source of funding, but at some point, if we keep this going, we may need to charge the costs to operate it. As far as things you can fix, Amazon has been remarkably good about providing researchers with small grants of free AWS time. And so we can give you explanations on how to apply for that. That seems to be a program they have worldwide. And you can fix the date issue by getting something in before the end of 2025. We're going to set that as the date somebody puts the application in, not necessarily the date the experiment runs. And so, you know, if you still need to pay people, that's money.
All right, thanks.
Thank you. I also have several questions, but one of them, I'm not sure if they need to be in order or just randomly going. If we care about dynamics and temporal aspects, and I want to do recommendation and speak with my participants. So each day I'm sending a newsletter and the participants will click. Should I retrain my model every day so to keep the time aspect going on?
So that really depends on the type of algorithm you're working with. If a couple of data points doesn't make a big difference in your model, retraining the model daily probably won't make sense. If you are studying a cold start problem, and this would not be cold start necessarily in our system, but it might be cold start related to some specific thing you're looking at, and you have a reason to believe that your model is really looking at rapid change in, you know, topical interest or something like that, you certainly could train it every day. The mechanism that we're using as the baseline mechanism calls you at the time that's needed to deliver each newsletter. We've already pre-designed but have not implemented the idea that for some people there will be I'd really like a call 2 hours beforehand to get my model training going, because it's going to take a while to have this ready to execute. And when we have the first studies that need that, we'll be putting something like that into effect.
So there's also a couple things, like you can replay with historical data just to see how much the incremental retraining would actually move your model parameters. But also our models and the direction we encourage people to think about first for model designs are models that are fairly durable in terms of the training results. So one particular thing, we're not training user embeddings. So we aren't doing like a matrix factorization thing where we learn the user matrix. We are representing a user directly with their history, and so the user embedding is basically the combination of their clicked articles and their topics, and that becomes the embedding. So we recompute the user's embedding on the fly. So what we're learning in our training, in our pre-training process, is we're learning a mapping from our article embeddings to be able to do recommendations, but that is relatively stable. And so we can take new articles, run them through the embedder, run the embedder through that, and the mapping from embedding space to recommendation and user action is going to change significantly less frequently than, say, a user embedding or like parameters that are tied to specific topics or events. It's one of the benefits of embedding spaces, but looking at designs that allow you to run for a week or run for your whole experiment without needing to do significant retraining, we're not limiting you to those designs, but those are designs that we encourage you to think about first.
Thank you. The next follow-up, and maybe you guess it, if I want to do some longitudinal effects. And I keep it abstract because, yeah, I want to see what will happen, and for some responsible or related news recommendation things, but for a longitudinal effect? And am I able to keep the set of users with whom I'm interacting instead of changing them? So I want to change only one variable, and it's time, but let's keep it with the same target.
So there are at least 3 ways to support that. One is, like, if you aren't wanting to make an intervention, retrospective analysis on historical data once we've had the platform up and running for a year or 2. The other is experiments can have multiple phases, and so you could have an experiment that runs for 6 weeks or 8 weeks that we'll want to talk during the intake phase about making sure that that doesn't block too many other experiments from running, but the ability for a long run. Also, with multiple phases, you can have an intervention phase and a follow-up phase. Be like, okay, I'm going to give my recommendations for 6 weeks, and then everybody's just going to get the baseline for 6 weeks, but they're still in my experiment, and I'm still watching what they're doing to see like a persistence. We support that through multiple phases. Each phase of the experiment has can have a different mapping of users to assignments. So you can throw everybody in baseline. You can do I'm too tired to remember the term, where you flip around the treatments. Yes, crossover design. The other one is our default is going to be every time you run an experiment, you get a fresh set of users. We scramble the user IDs. However, if you have an experiment that you want to run as a follow-up to a previous, you can propose that, and we can, if we decide it's a good idea to run, or our team decides it's a good idea to run, we have the provision to run a second experiment with the same users and user IDs as a previous one. So you can run a follow-up. It just isn't the default.
Just to add one more thing, running a follow-up doesn't necessarily mean more experiment. It might be as simple as saying, I've got a 6-week experiment, but I want to do a follow-up at 6 months and at a year where I get a report on behavior, knowing that those people have been distributed through other experiments in the meantime, but I'm looking for, are there long-term effects that average over the population? And yes, that's a big part of why we want long-term users, because one-shot experiments just don't tell you as much as longitudinal ones for many interesting questions. We have time for 1 to 2 more questions.
I was wondering what other user studies do you envision, in what other domains, and would it also imply the collaboration with another organization?
Yeah, that is a great question. So, I mean, obviously we're starting here with AP, you know, we have this newsletter. We definitely want to move towards an app that would, you know, so it's more interactive, you have more feedback, you have, you know, richer, you know, kind of, you know, ways that you can look at users' experience, and of course it's more like the things people would do with news all the time. So, so that's definitely one direction that we want to evolve. I think another direction we want to evolve is in the direction of additional news sources. So you're not just looking at AP, and maybe that's something that's configurable by experimenter. You know, there's a big design space there, and we've really not explored it. And then I think the other question is, you know, we have POPROX news. Do we have POPROX music? Do we have POPROX, you know, video games? I don't know. Like, I mean, I think the opportunity to, you know, offer, you know, live user experiments with long-term, you know, user base, I think that's valuable in all kinds of domains. But news is where we started. I think it's a particularly, you know, societally important one, but I don't think we necessarily want to be limited to that. And if you know somebody who has a lot of money that would like to support something like that, give them our email address.
I also think for the next couple of years, let us get this working. But after that, the idea that a partner might come in and say, hey, we want to take what you've started with, maybe even work with you, but create a spin-off. We're serious about this being open. If you just simply want to take our code and say, oh, we're going to go do the same thing and we're going to change news to fan fiction, go do it. But if you want to do that as a partner, we're also open to that once we've got ourselves in regular operating condition. I'm not seeing more hands, so why don't we take that as a sign thank you for coming. Folks here will stick around for a little bit if you've got questions, and enjoy your lunch and the rest of the day.
The other thing I would say is check out the documentation if you want to learn more, and if you want to fill out an intake form and send it our way, we'll start talking about your proposal.